Hi, I'm Tenny-Brittian, and I'm the instructor for this course, and I'll bet you already know that. Hi, I'm Tenny-Brittian. I am the instructor for the Proclamation of the Word. Let's try again. Hi there. I'm Tenny-Brittian, and I'm the instructor for the course Proclamation of the Word. This is Lecture 1, and I'm guessing you probably already know that. I want to start this course out and this lesson out by asking you a rather complex but simple question. What do you think is the point of preaching? How you answer that question will determine your personal success as a preacher. Whether that's a preacher who preaches once in a while, or whether that's a preacher who preaches every single Sunday, maybe 3 or 4 times in a large church. You know, great preachers, successful preachers, they're not born. None of us are born with a golden spoon. Yes, some of us can, shoot the breeze and stand up and expound on one topic or another easier than others. But great preachers, great successful preachers, they're not born, they're trained. And we get trained in a variety of ways. We get trained to begin with by watching other preachers. And depending on who you've been watching, whether they're a great preacher or an okay preacher, or wow, really have to endure that. And I'm betting you've heard a little bit of all of those. How you learn from them and what you learn from them is partly how you're going to preach. You're going to say, oh, I like that, I don't like that. And if you've only watched one or two preachers and haven't been exposed to a variety of preaching styles and preachers, then you're going to be pretty limited. And that's not a good thing, because you want to look and get a wide variety of examples of preaching. So you go, I didn't know you could do that. So you start learning how to preach by watching. But you're also going to learn how to preach in this course and in other courses by reading, by studying, by picking up books or watching videos or instruction videos and responding on the discussion forums here. You're going to learn by study. And in this course, I have to tell you, the books you're going to read are they're really good. They're very in-depth. Some of them are easier to read than others. Buttrick is a real bear to read, but he is one of the foundational preaching teachers, or homiletics preachers, if you want to use the proper word, that in the United States. And it's going to give you a really good foundation. It's going to serve you well, but there's a lot of reading, so you don't put it off until the end of the week. Start reading now. All right, and the last way you learn preaching is by practice. You got to get up there and do it. You got to do it over and over and over. The problem is, and you've heard this phrase, practice makes perfect. That is as far from the truth as you can get. Practice does not make perfect. Practice makes ingrained. It will ingrain whatever it is that you're practicing. So if you have a sermon style that has some flaws in it, and you repeat those flaws over and over and over again, then you're going to find yourself having a perfectly flawed sermon delivery system over and over and over again. So you don't want to practice the flaws, and you want to learn, you want to pay close attention. Even if you've been preaching for 10 or 15 years on either full-time or part-time, there's things you're going to learn here that will help make you a better preacher. I hope you'll be a better preacher than I am. I hope you'll be a better preacher than Andy Stanley or Nadia Bolton-Myers or whoever it is that you aspire to be. And you can do that. You see, you can learn to be a great preacher. You can learn to be a successful preacher, but it all depends on how you define it, how you define what you want, and then what you do to learn how to do that, because you can become the preacher that you want to become. But you're going to have to do some definitions. You're going to have to make some decisions up front. Like, what is a great preacher? What are the characteristics of a great preacher? What does that look like? If you watch the great preachers, and again, who that is largely going to be determined by your subjectiveness. What you like, what you don't like, what you find appealing, what you find, ew, I couldn't do that. But what is a great preacher? It's the definition you're going to need to be making in your discussion forum this week. And then, what constitutes a great sermon? Is it the length? Is it the content? Is it the delivery? Is it a little of all the above? Is it what is it that makes a great sermon? And you're going to want to define that. And the reason I'm asking you to define that is because you're going to find that at the end of the course as well. And we're going to see how you've changed and what that looks like at the end of this course. The reality is both this, what is a great preacher and what constitutes a great sermon, both those questions are subjective. I'm going to have my answers, you're going to have your answers, but I'm going to impose some of my answers on you because I'm the professor of the course, and so I get to do that. And you can forget all about it when you leave if you want to. But for the duration of this course, you're going to learn my definition of what is a great preacher and what constitutes a great sermon. And I hope that you'll learn from that, even if you disagree with me. And it's okay if you do after the course is over. All right, so how you answer those questions is going to determine your success as a pastor. The problem is that what does that word mean? What is a successful preacher? What does that look like? What is not just a great preacher, but what's success? And that may be different. You're going to hear and see some great preaching in this course, but you're also going to see in some of these preachers, you're going to see some not very successful sermons. So what is, or how do you determine the success of a sermon? And here's another question you're going to have to answer in the class is, what is your definition of a great all the way back to a great preacher? So let me launch into some questions for you to wrestle with. Some questions you're going to wrestle with in the discussion forum. To start off with, what is a great preacher? What makes a preacher great? Is it they have a big crowd following them, or what is it? Is it? So I got a couple questions that we're going. And so that leads to the question, what is a great preacher? You're going to model yourself after someone or a variety of someone's, and you need to decide on your own what's a great preacher. And besides what's a great preacher, what constitutes a great sermon? Is it the length? Is it the content? Is it the delivery? All of the above? What is it? What constitutes a great sermon? Now, the answer to those questions are pretty subjective. You're going to have your own opinions, and I have my opinions, and the reality is I'm going to impose some of my opinions on you. That's the beauty of being the professor of the course. You don't have to agree with me necessarily, but I'm hoping you'll see some of the wisdom in the definitions that I'm going to help you develop about what is a great preacher and what constitutes a great sermon, so that you can look at a variety of preaching and sermons, preachers and sermons, and I hate this. And so you're going to have to answer a couple questions for yourself and, of course, in the discussion forum as well. First, what is a great preacher? How can you tell if it's a great preacher? And so you're going to have to answer a couple questions to determine, what kind of a great preacher you want to be. So the first question you have to wrestle with, both in your heart and your mind, as well as on the discussion forum here in a little bit, is what is a great preacher and what constitutes a great sermon? Those two things are subjective, I know, but you're going to have to decide, what is it that I think really sets a pastor or preacher apart from everybody else? What makes them great? And which of those sermons, what does a sermon have to do to really constitute this really awesome, great sermon that just, moves, touches, and inspires you? And that is a subjective answer. You're going to have your opinions, and my opinions are different, but I am going to impose some of my answers on you. I'm going to teach some of my answers to you because I think there's some wisdom in coming down to some definitions that make a difference in the world. And for me, that's what preaching is about, is changing the world by changing hearts. How you answer those questions, whether you answer my way or your way, is largely going to determine the success of a preacher and the success of the sermons and the success of the pastor's career. So there's an additional question you're going to have to wrestle with is, how can you measure the success of a sermon? How do you know whether that sermon landed where it was supposed to land? And is it because everyone shakes your hand as they go out, it's a great sermon, preacher? Or is there some other determination of what makes a great sermon? And finally, in this vein, how will you know when you get done preaching, when you're 65, 68, 72, whenever it is that you hang up your preaching spurs, put away your preaching notes, how will you know whether your preaching career has been successful? What will determine that for you? And that's an important question because the end is in the beginning. What you start doing now will help determine how you're going to end up as a preacher. As you wrestle with these questions, you're going to have to make some determinations of what are the markers, what are the criteria for deciding what's great, for deciding what's successful. Because if you don't have those markers, you're just going to wander all over the place. So be thinking about that. And of course, we're going to talk about that in the discussion forum later on. One of the components of great preaching, at least as far as I can tell, is engagement by the congregation. Those who are hearing you and how engaged they are with what it is you have to say and what you're communicating. And to that end, I want to start off by talking about what is probably one of the most difficult parts of preaching, and that's what you do before you start preaching. And that is sermon titles. I have to tell you that as I've looked at preaching over the years, as I've studied it, and as I've done it, titling a sermon is one of the most difficult things we do. It's really hard to really nail down and get a good title because it's so important what those titles do. Those titles are important because they're supposed to do something for us. You put the title on the marquee, on the sign of the church, and hopefully people go, oh, I want to hear that. So there's two things that a good sermon title has to do for you, or actually has to do for others. Number one, the number one thing that a good sermon title does is that it's there to pique interest, to try and get people to go, oh, wow, that's cool. The problem is so often preachers pick titles that are cute and clever. And cute and clever are the enemies of your sermons because cute and clever don't communicate. They're the tweedledee and the tweedledum of preaching because a cute and clever title doesn't do the next little bit. It doesn't communicate. It doesn't communicate some understanding of what the topic of the sermon is. And see, that's the two things that your sermon title has to do. It has to pique their interest, and it has to communicate some understanding of what the topic of that sermon is going to be. Because just because your sermon is cute, your sermon title. And so I want to touch on one of the components In my opinion, one of the components of great preaching is engagement by the audience. How can you tell whether your sermon is going well? How engaged are the audience? Are they sitting on the edge of the seat? Are they listening to you? Is it making a difference? Are they interested? That particular component of preaching is important, but that particular component starts before you even open your mouth to preach, or actually probably before you even start to write your sermon. I want to touch on sermon titles, because sermon titles are incredibly important, because that sermon title sets the stage for where you're going and what you're going to say and what others are expecting you to say. But the problem is that titling your sermons is difficult. In fact, in my opinion, it's more difficult than almost anything else you're going to do when it comes to creating and delivering your sermon. A good sermon title has to do two things. In fact, a sermon title has two responsibilities. The first responsibility is to generate interest. The title has got to be interesting enough that people go, it turns their head. They see it on your church sign and go, oh, wow, interesting. Hadn't thought about that. I wonder. That's point one. But point two, the second thing that a sermon title has to do, and a good sermon title does, is it communicates some understanding of what that topic of your sermon is going to be. In other words, it gets my interest, but also tells me whether that topic or that sermon title, the sermon is going to be delivered, is relevant to me. Because I'm only going to show up at your church if you have a relevant sermon title that I am interested in going to hear, because it's somehow going to touch my life, make a difference in my life. Over the years, I've seen a lot of really interesting, clever, cute titles. But the problem with cute and clever titles is they're really the Tweedledee and the Tweedledum of preaching, because a cute and clever title doesn't tell the person what that sermon is about. One of my favorite sermon titles ever is Two Fools and a Henpecked Husband. Now, I like the title of that sermon. It's clever. It's cute. Can you tell me what that sermon's going to be about? It really sounds like it's about a marriage that's falling apart. If I was deciding, looking at the title and saying, what is that? Again, it's a cute title, but it's a Tweedledee and Tweedledum title, because it doesn't tell your prospective audience, when they see it on the church sign, they go, yeah, cute, clever. I wonder but it's not enough to draw them in to want to hear it. And that's part of what a sermon title has to do, or is intended to do. It has to communicate some understanding and says, hey, I'm relevant. So one of the most relevant sermon titles I've ever seen is, what does the Bible say about alcohol? I can tell you that although that may not be a really, woo kind of title, it does pique interest, particularly to the audience that particular sermon is trying to draw out. It just piques interest. Someone driving by who doesn't really know, that's a good question, because, Christians say all the time, you're not supposed to drink. And so what does the Bible say? What does the Bible really say about drinking and about alcohol? And I can tell you that when I use that title, and I did use that title, I stole it from somebody else. I'm not the first person to come up with that particular title. We had people show up at worship who came specifically because they said, I'm interested in this topic. So it caught their interest, and it told them what the sermon was going to be about. They told them that it was relevant to what their interest was. And so that's the fourth and the final question this week. I want you to test a sermon title. So here's your assignment. I want you to read Luke chapter 14, verses 16 to 23. Luke 14, 16 to 23. That's a parable. And I want you to develop in your head, don't sit down and write down a sermon. I want you to develop in your head what that sermon that you would preach out of that parable would be about. And I want you to develop three sermon titles, three different sermon titles that you think is interesting enough that someone might want to stop by and hear it, but also communicates an understanding of what that sermon is about. So the two things that, if you put it up on a signboard and someone drove by, they go, wow, that's interesting. And they'd be interested enough to come and hear it. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write those 3 titles down. I just want you to write the titles. I don't want you to write the scripture down. I don't want you to write any sort of description down. I just want you to write title, title, title. And then I want you to take those titles to someone who is outside the church. And when I say outside the church, I mean preferably someone who's not a believer, someone who doesn't have a whole lot of Christian experience. And I want you to test those titles. Now, here's a reality. I'm presuming, and if you've taken my evangelism course, you know why I presume, but I'm presuming you have unchurched friends. Because if you don't have unchurched friends, if you don't have people you know who are beyond the realm of Christianity, then how in the world are you going to be effective in the Great Commission? And you and I and everyone in your church has been charged with that commandment. Go ye therefore in all the world and make disciples. And you can't do that if you don't know any unchurched people. So I'm hoping you know someone unchurched. Now, if the COVID thing has got you still locked down, you've got Zoom, you've got Facebook, you know people who are unchurched. You may not have a great relationship and then there was a close relationship with them, and if not, you should be building that. But you know people who are not in church, even if it's a relative. Get them to look at the 3 titles and do 2 things. Number 1, and I want you to write these down as they share so you have an idea so you can report to us. Number 1, get them to pick their favorite title. Again, you are not to give them any instructions. You can, other than say, hey, I got 3 sermon titles here that I'm looking at. Which one do you like the best? Let them pick it. And once they've chosen that title, then I want you to ask a simple question. Ask them to share what they think that sermon would be about, and write that down. Again, you're not correcting them. You're not giving them any hints about how you're planning on going with that. But what is it that they think that title is going to be about? That's how you can tell whether a title does what it's supposed to do. Is it interesting? What's their favorite? Is it interesting? Do they think this title is interesting? And do they get it right? Do they understand what this title, the title of the sermon, what the sermon might actually be about? And whether that's going to be relevant to them. So 2 things. Have them pick. Get them to tell you why they like it. And second is get them to tell you what they think that sermon is going to be about. If it's a good title, they'll get it right. You will have whatever it is you had in your mind, they'll go, yeah, that matches. But if it doesn't match, if it's like this, then you don't have a good title and you need to rework it, because you want people to have a good idea before they show up about what that sermon is basically going to be about. One last thing. I want to share a story about preaching that is really foundational for this whole course. Once upon a time, and by the way, this is a true story, Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, when he was president, he went to church pretty regularly. And of course, he was president of the United States, so it was a big deal when he went to church. And so he went to a high steeple church there in Washington, D.C. And as he came out, the paparazzi, okay, they weren't paparazzi, they were just the press, but the press was out there, and someone asked him, Mr. President, did you hear a great sermon? Reportedly, this was Abraham Lincoln's response. He said, he was a good orator. But was it a great sermon? No. Because the preacher didn't ask me to do anything great. Which comes back to that question that I started with. What's the point of preaching? What's the point? How you answer that question will largely determine your success or your failure as a preacher. We'll see you on the forums.